Hello everyone, it's me again. Days ago, I was reading this book to my mom. We were having some quality time together, and I was helping her with her English language skills. But as I was reading through this book, I couldn't help but think that I really wanted my students to hear this story as well. I don't know if you have read this book or not, but that's why I decided I want to record this video for you. It's called Who Moved My Cheese, written by Dr. Spencer Johnson, a New York Times best-selling author who's already written another one of the best New York Times best-selling uh, books, The 1 Minute Manager. Who Moved My Cheese is an amazing way to deal with change in your work and your life. In the back cover, it reads, written for all ages, this story takes less than an hour to read, but its unique insights can last for a lifetime. Who Moved My Cheese is a simple parable that reveals profound truths. It's an amusing and enlightening story of four characters who live in a maze and look for cheese to nourish them and make them happy. Cheese is a metaphor for what you want to have in life, whether it's a good job, a loving relationship, money or a possession, health or spiritual peace of mind. And the maze is where you look for what you want. It could be the organization you work in, or the family or community you live in. This profound book from the best-selling author Dr. Spencer Johnson will show you how to anticipate change, adapt to change quickly, enjoy change, be ready to change quickly again and again. You can discover the secrets for yourself and learn how to deal with change so that you suffer less stress and enjoy more success in your work and in life. I remember the first time I read this story. I was a young man, probably 2 decades, well over 2 decades ago. And I remember that I was so inspired by it. And I sincerely hope that it will have the same effect on you today. The book starts with a preface section. It's called The Story Behind the Story, written by Dr. Kenneth Blanchard, another amazing author who co-wrote The 1 Minute Manager with Dr. Johnson. So I feel like it's a good idea to start here. Um, if you're impatient and you want to get to the story faster, of course you can skip forward and find where the story starts. But if you can, stay with me. The Story Behind the Story by Kenneth Blanchard. I'm thrilled to be telling you the story behind the story of Who Moved My Cheese, because it means the book has now been written and is available for all of us to read, enjoy, and share with others. This is something I wanted to see happen ever since I first heard Spencer Johnson tell his great cheese story years ago, before we wrote our book, The 1 Minute Manager, together. I remember thinking then how good the story was and how helpful it would be to me from that moment on. Who Moved My Cheese is a story about change that takes place in a maze, where four amusing characters look for cheese, cheese being a metaphor for what we want to have in life, whether it's a job, a relationship, money, a big house, freedom, health, recognition, spiritual peace, or even an activity like jogging or golf. Each of us has our own idea of what cheese is, and we pursue it because we believe it makes us happy. If we get it, we often become attached to it, and if we lose it, or if it's taken away, it can be traumatic. The maze in this story represents where you spend time looking for what you want. It can be the organization you work in, the community you live in, or the relationships you have in your life. I tell the cheese story that you're about to read in my talks around the world, and often hear later from people about how what a difference it has made to them. Believe it or not, this little story has been credited with saving careers, marriages, and lives. One of the many real life examples comes from Charlie Jones, a well respected broadcaster for NBC TV, who revealed that hearing the story of Who Moved My Cheese saved his career. His job as a broadcaster is unique, but the principles he learned can be used by anyone. Here is what happened to Charlie. Charlie had worked hard and done a great job of broadcasting track and field events at an earlier Olympics Games. So he was surprised and upset when his boss told him he'd been removed from these showcase events for the next Olympics and assigned to swimming and diving. Not knowing these sports as well, he was frustrated. He felt unappreciated and he became angry. He said he felt it wasn't fair. His anger began to affect everything he did. Then he heard the story of Who Moved My Cheese. After that, he said, he laughed at himself and changed his attitude. He realized his boss had just moved his cheese, so he adapted. He learned the two new sports and in the process found that doing something new made him feel young. It wasn't long before his boss recognized his new attitude and energy, and he soon got better assignments. He went on to enjoy more success than ever and was later inducted into Pro Football Hall of Fame Broadcasters Alley. That's just one of the many real life stories I've heard about the impact this story has had on people, from their work life to their life. I'm such a strong believer in the power of Who Moved My Cheese that I recently gave a copy of an early pre-publication edition to everyone working with our company, more than 200 people. Why? Because, like every company that wants to not only survive in the future, but stay competitive, Blanchard training and development is constantly changing. They keep moving our cheese. While in the past we may have wanted loyal employees, today we need flexible people who are not possessive about the way things are done around here. And yet, as you know, living in constant white water with changes occurring all the time at work or in life can be stressful. Unless people have a way of looking at change that helps them understand it. Enter the cheese story. When I told people about the story and then they got to read Who Moved My Cheese, you could almost feel the release of negative energy beginning to occur. People, person after person from every department, went out of their way to thank me for the book and told me how helpful it had been to them already in seeing the changes going on in our company in a different light. Believe me, this brief parable takes little time to read, but its impact can be profound. As you turn the pages, you will find three sections in this book. In the first, called A Gathering, former classmates talk at a class reunion about trying to deal with changes happening in their lives. The second section is the story of Who Moved My Cheese, the core of the book. In the third section, called A Discussion, people discuss what the story meant to them and how they're going to use it in their work and in their lives. Some readers of this book's early manuscript preferred to stop at the end of the story without reading further and interpret its meanings for themselves. Others enjoyed reading a discussion section that follows because it stimulated their thinking about how they might apply what they'd learned to their own situation. In any case, I hope each time you reread Who Moved My Cheese, you'll find something new and useful in it, as I do, and that it will help you deal with change and bring you success whatever you decide success is for you. I hope you enjoy what you discover, and I wish you well. Remember, move with the cheese. Ken Blanchard, San Diego, 1998. So the book starts here, and we start with the gathering story. A gathering happening in Chicago. One sunny Sunday in Chicago, several former classmates gathered for lunch, having attended their high school reunion the night before. They wanted to hear more about what was happening in each other's lives. After a good deal of kidding and a good meal, they settled into an interesting conversation. Angela, who'd been one of the most popular people in the class, said life sure turned out differently than I thought it would have been when we were at school. A lot had changed. It certainly has, Nathan echoed. They knew he had gone into his family's business, which had operated pretty much the same and had been a part of the local community for as long as they could remember. So they were surprised that he seemed concerned. He asked, "But have you noticed how we don't want to change when things change?" Carlos said, "I guess we resist change because we're afraid of change." "Carlos, you were the captain of the football team," Jessica said. "I never thought I'd hear you say anything about being afraid." They all laughed as they realized that although they had gone off in different directions, from working at home to managing companies, they were experiencing similar feelings. Everyone was trying to cope with the unexpected changes that were happening to them in recent years. And most admitted that they did not know a good way to handle them. Then Michael said, "I used to be afraid of change. When a big change came along in our business, we didn't know what to do. So we didn't do anything differently and we almost lost it. That is," he continued, "until I heard a funny little story that changed everything." "How so?" Nathan asked. "Well, the story altered the way I looked at change, and after that, things quickly improved for me, at work and in my life. Then I passed the story on to some people in our company, and they passed it on to others, and soon our business did much better because we all adapted to change better. And like me, many people said it helped them in their personal lives." "What's the story?" Angela asked. "It's called Who Moved My Cheese." The group laughed. "I think I like it already," Carlos said. "Would you tell us the story?" "Sure," Michael replied. "I'd be happy to. It doesn't take long." And so he began the story. Once, a long time ago, in a land far away, there lived four little characters who ran through a maze looking for cheese to nourish them and to make them happy. Two were mice named Sniff and Scurry, and two were little people, beings who were as small as mice but who looked and acted a lot like people today. Their names were Hem and Haw. Due to their small size, it would be easy not to notice what the four of them were doing, but if you looked closely enough, you could discover the most amazing things. Every day, the mice and the little people spent time in the maze looking for their own special cheese. The mice, Sniff and Scurry, possessing only simple rodent brains but good instincts, searched for the hard nibbling cheese they liked, as mice often do. The two little people, Hem and Haw, used their brains, filled with many beliefs, to search for a very different kind of cheese, with a capital C, it reads here, which they believed would make them feel happy and successful. As different as the mice and little people were, they shared something in common. Every morning, they each put on their jogging suits and running shoes, left their little homes, and raced out into the maze looking for their favorite cheese. The maze was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, some containing delicious cheese and some nuts. There were also dark corners and blind alleys leading nowhere. It was an easy place for anyone to get lost. However, for those who found a way, the maze held secrets that let them enjoy a better life. The mice, Sniff and Scurry, used the simple but inefficient trial and error method of finding cheese. They ran down one corridor, and if it proved empty, they turned and ran down another. Sniff would smell out the general direction of the cheese using his great nose, and Scurry would race ahead. They got lost, as you might expect, went off in the wrong direction, and often bumped into the walls. However, the two little people, Hem and Haw, used a different method that relied on their ability to think and to learn from their past experiences, although they would sometimes get confused by their own beliefs and emotions. Sound similar? Eventually, in their own way, they all discovered what they were looking for. They each found their own kind of cheese one day, and at the end of one of the corridors, let's call it in the cheese station C with the capital C. Every morning after that, the mice and the little people dressed in their running gear and headed over to the cheese station C. C represents, I think it's an abbreviation for the word currant, the currant cheese. It wasn't long before that they each established their own routine. Sniff and Scurry continued to wake early every day and race through the maze, always following the same route. When they arrived at their destination, the mice took off their running shoes, tied them together, and hung them around their necks so they could get to them quickly whenever they needed them again. Then they enjoyed the cheese. In the beginning, Hem and Haw also raced towards Cheese Station C every morning to enjoy the tasty new morsels that awaited them, but after a while, a different routine set in for the little people. Hem and Haw awoke each day a little later, dressed a little slower, and walked to the cheese station C instead of running. After all, they knew where the cheese was now and how to get there. They had no idea where the cheese came from or who put it there. They just assumed it would be there. As soon as Hem and Haw arrived at the cheese station C each morning, they settled in, made themselves at home, hung up their jogging suits, put away their running shoes, and put on their slippers. They were becoming very comfortable now and that they had found the cheese. "This is great," Hem said. "There's enough cheese here to last us forever." The little people felt happy and successful and thought they were now secure. It wasn't long before Hem and Haw regarded the cheese they found at Cheese Station C as their cheese. It was such a large store of cheese that they eventually moved their homes to be closer to it and built a social life around it. To make themselves feel more at home, Hem and Haw decorated the walls with sayings and even drew some pictures of cheese around them, that which made them smile. One read, "Having cheese makes you happy." Sounds like a haiku. Sometimes Hem and Haw would take their friends by to see their pile of cheese at Cheese Station C and point to it with pride, saying, "Pretty nice, huh?" Sometimes they shared it with their friends and sometimes they didn't. "We deserve the cheese," Hem said. "We certainly had to work long and hard enough to find it." He picked up a nice fresh piece and ate it. Afterwards, Hem fell asleep, as he often did. Every night, the little people would waddle home, full of cheese, and every morning they would confidently return for more. This went on for quite some time. After a while, Hem's and Haw's confidence grew into arrogance. Soon they became so comfortable they didn't even notice what was happening. As time went on, Sniff and Scurry continued their routine. They arrived early each morning and sniffed and scratched and scurried around Cheese Station C, inspecting the area to see if there had been any changes from the day before. Then they would sit down to nibble on the cheese. One morning they arrived at Cheese Station C and discovered, da-na-na-na, there was no cheese. They weren't surprised, since Sniff and Scary had noticed the supply of cheese had been getting smaller every day. They were prepared for the inevitable and knew instinctively what to do. They looked at each other, removed the running shoes they had tied together and hung conveniently around their necks, put them on their feet, laced them up. The mice did not overanalyze things, and they were not burdened with many complex beliefs. To the mice, the problem and the answer were both simple. The situation at Cheese Station C had changed, so Sniff and Scary decided to change. They both looked out into the maze. Then Sniff lifted his nose, sniffed, and nodded to Scary, who took off running through the maze while Sniff followed as fast as he could. They were quickly off in search of new cheese. Later that same day, Hem and Haw arrived at Cheese Station C. They had not been paying attention to the small changes that had been taking place each day, so they took it for granted their cheese would be there. They were unprepared for what they found. "What? No cheese?" Hem yelled. He continued yelling, "No cheese! No cheese!" as though if he shouted loud enough someone would put it back. "Who moved my cheese?" he hollered. Finally, he put on his hands on his hips, his face turned red, and he screamed at the top of his voice, "It's not fair!" He just shook his head in the Haw, the friend, shook his head in disbelief. He too had counted on finding cheese at Cheese Station C. He stood there for a long time, frozen with shock. He was just not ready for this. Hem was yelling something, but Haw didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to deal with what was facing him, so he just tuned everything out. The little people's behavior was not very attractive or productive, but it was understandable. Finding cheese wasn't easy, and it meant a great deal more to the little people than just having enough of it to eat every day. Finding cheese was the little people's way of getting what they thought they needed to be happy. They had their own ideas of what cheese meant to them, depending on their taste, of course. For some, finding cheese was having material things. For others, it was enjoying good health or developing a spiritual sense of well-being. For Haw, cheese just meant feeling safe, having a loving family someday, and living in a cozy cottage on Cheddar Lane. To Hem, cheese was becoming the big cheese, in charge of others, and owning a big house atop Camembert Hill, if you know those different types of cheese. Because cheese was important to them, the two little people spent a long time trying to decide what to do. All they could think of was to keep looking around Cheeseless Station C to see if the cheese was really gone. While Sniff and Scary had quickly moved on, Hem and Haw continued to hem and haw. They ranted and raved at the injustice of it all. Haw started to get depressed. What would happen if the cheese wasn't there tomorrow? He'd made future plans based on this cheese. The little people couldn't believe it. How could this have happened? No one had warned them. It wasn't right. It was not the way things were supposed to be. Hem and Haw went home that night, hungry and discouraged. But before they left, Haw wrote on the wall, another one of these, and it reads, "The more important your cheese is to you, the more you want to hold on to it. The next day, Ham and Haw left their homes and returned to Cheese Station C again, where they still expected somehow to find their cheese. The situation hadn't changed. The cheese was no longer there. The little people didn't know what to do. Ham and Haw just stood there, immobilized like two statues. Haw shut his eyes as tight as he could and put his hands over his ears. He just wanted to block everything out. He didn't want to know the cheese supply had gradually been getting smaller. He believed it. He believed it had been moved all of a sudden. Ham analyzed the situation over and over, and eventually his complicated brain with its huge belief system took a hold. Why did they do this to me? He demanded. What's really going on here? Finally, Haw opened his eyes, looked around, and said, By the way, where are Sniff and Scurry? Do you think they know something we don't? Ham scoffed. What would they know? Ham continued. They're just simple mice. They just respond to what happens. We're little people. We're special. We should be able to figure this out. And besides, we deserve better. This should not happen to us. Or if it does, we should at least get some benefits. Why should we get benefits? Haw asked. Because we're entitled, Ham claimed. Entitled to what? Haw wanted to know. We're entitled to our cheese. But why? Haw asked. Because we didn't cause this problem, Ham said. Somebody else did this, and we should get something out of it. Haw suggested maybe we should stop analyzing the situation so much and just get going and find some new cheese. Oh no, Ham argued. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. While Ham and Haw were still trying to decide what to do, Sniff and Scurry were already well on their way. They went further into the maze, up and down the corridors, looking for cheese in every cheese in every cheese station they could find. They didn't think of anything else but finding new cheese. They didn't find any for some time until they finally went into an area of the maze where they had never been before. Let's call it Cheese Station N. N is an abbreviation for new. So that was current cheese and this is new cheese. They squealed with delight. They found what they'd been looking for, a great supply of new cheese. They could hardly believe their eyes. It was the biggest store of cheese the mice had ever seen. In the meantime, Ham and Haw were still back in Cheese Station C, evaluating the situation. They were now suffering from the effects of having no cheese. They were becoming frustrated and angry, and were blaming each other for the situation they were in. Now and then, Haw thought about his mice buddies, Sniff and Scurry, and wondered if they had found any cheese yet. He believed they might be having a hard time, as running through the maze usually involved some uncertainty. But he also knew that it was likely to only last for a while. Sometimes Haw would imagine Sniff and Scurry finding new cheese and enjoying it. He thought about how good it would be for him to be out on an adventure in the maze and to find fresh new cheese. He could almost taste it. The more clearly Haw saw the image of himself finding and enjoying cheese, the more he saw himself leaving Cheese Station C. Let's go, he exclaimed all of a sudden. No, Ham quickly responded. I like it here. It's comfortable. It's what I know. Besides, it's dangerous out there. No, it isn't, Haw argued. We've run through many parts of the maze before, and we can do it again. Oh, I'm getting too old for that, Ham said. And I'm afraid I'm not interested in getting lost and making a fool of myself. Are you? With that, Haw's Fear of failing returned, and his hope of finding new cheese faded. So, every day the little people continued to do what they had done before. They went to Cheese Station C, found no cheese, and returned home, carrying their worries and frustrations with them. They tried to deny what was happening, but found it harder to get to sleep, had less energy the next day, and were becoming irritable. The homes were not the nurturing places they once were. The little people had difficulty sleeping and were having nightmares about not finding any cheese. But Hem and Haw still returned to Cheese Station C, waited there, and waited there every day. Hem said, "You know, if we just work harder, we'll find that nothing has really changed that much. The cheese is probably nearby. Maybe they just hid it behind the wall." The next day, Hem and Haw returned with tools. Hem held the chisel while Haw banged on the hammer until they made a hole in the wall of the Cheese Station C. They peered into it and found no cheese. They were disappointed and believed that they could solve the problem. So they started earlier. They stayed longer and worked harder, but after a while, all they had was a large hole in the wall. Haw was beginning to realize the difference between activity and productivity. "Maybe," Hem said, "we should just sit here and see what happens. Sooner or later, they will have to put the cheese back." Haw wanted to believe that, but each day he went home to rest and returned reluctantly with Hem to Cheese Station C, and the cheese never reappeared. By now, the little people were growing weak from the hunger and stress. Haw was getting tired of just waiting for the situation to improve. He began to see that the longer they stayed in their cheeseless situation, the worse off they would be. Haw knew they were losing their edge. Finally, one day, Haw began laughing at himself. "Ha ha, look at me. I keep doing the same things over and over again and wonder why things don't get better. If this wasn't so ridiculous, it would be even funnier." Haw did not like the idea of having to run through the maze again because he knew he would get lost and had no idea where he would find any cheese. But he had to laugh at his folly when he saw what his fear was doing to him. He asked Hem, "Where did we put our jogging suits and running shoes?" It took a long time to find them because they had put everything away when they found the cheese at Cheese Station C, thinking they wouldn't need them anymore. As Hem saw his friend getting into his running gear, he said, "You're not really going out in the maze again, are you? Why don't you just wait here with me until they put the cheese back?" "Because you just don't get it," Haw said. "I didn't want to see it either, but now I realize they're never going to put the old cheese back. That's the yesterday's cheese. It's time to find new cheese." Hem argued, "But what if there's no cheese out there? Or even if there is, what if we don't find it?" "I don't know," Haw said. He'd asked himself those same questions too many times and started to feel the fears again that kept him where he was. Then he thought about finding new cheese and all the good things that came with it and gathered his courage. "Sometimes," Haw said, "things change, and they're never the same again. This looks like one of those times, Hem. That's life. Life moves on, and so should we." Haw looked at his emaciated companion and tried to talk sense into him, but Hem's fear had turned into anger, and he wouldn't listen. Haw didn't mean to be rude to his friend, but he had to laugh at how silly they both looked. As Haw prepared to leave, he started to feel more alive, knowing that he was finally able to laugh at himself, let go, and move on. He announced, "It's maze time." Hem didn't laugh, and he didn't respond. Haw picked up a small sharp rock and wrote a serious thought on the wall for Ham to think about. As was his custom, Ha even drew a picture of cheese around it, hoping it would help Ham to smile, lighten up, and go after the new cheese, but Ham didn't want to see it. It read, "If you don't change, you can become extinct." Then Ha stuck his head out and peered anxiously into the maze. He thought about how he'd gotten himself into this cheeseless situation. He had believed that there may not be any cheese in the maze, or he may not find it. Such fearful beliefs were immobilizing and killing him. Ha smiled. He knew Hem was wondering who moved my cheese, but Ha was wondering, why didn't I get up and move with the cheese sooner? As he started out in the maze, Hall looked back to where he'd come from and felt its comfort. He could feel himself being drawn back into familiar territory, even though he hadn't found cheese there for some time. Hall became more anxious and wondered if he really wanted to go out into the maze. He wrote a saying on the wall ahead of him and stared at it for some time. What would you do if you weren't afraid? He thought about it. He knew sometimes some fear can be good. When you're afraid things are going to get worse if you don't do something, it can prompt you into action. But it's not good when you're so afraid that it keeps you from doing anything. He looked to his right, to the part of the maze where he'd never been, and felt the fear. Then he took a deep breath, turned right to the maze, and jogged slowly into the unknown. As he tried to find his way, Haw worried at first that he might have waited too long in the cheese station C. He hadn't had any cheese for so long that it was now so weak. It took him longer, and it was more painful than usual to get through the maze. He decided that if he ever got the chance again, he would adapt to change sooner. It would make things easier. Then, Haw smiled, a weak smile as he thought, better late than never. During the next several days, Haw found a little cheese here and there, but nothing that lasted very long. He hoped to find enough cheese to take some back to him and encourage him to come out into the maze. But Haw didn't feel confident enough yet. He had to admit he found it confusing in the maze. Things seemed to have changed since the last time he was out there. Just when he thought he was getting ahead, he would get lost in the corridors. It seemed his progress was 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. It was a challenge, but he had to admit that being back in the maze, hunting for cheese, wasn't nearly as bad as he feared it might be. As time went on, he began to wonder if it was realistic for him to expect to find new cheese. He wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. Then he laughed, realizing that he had nothing to chew on at the moment. Whenever he started to get discouraged, he reminded himself that what he was doing, as uncomfortable as it was at the moment, was in reality much better than staying in cheeseless station. He was taking control rather than simply letting things happen to him. Then he reminded himself, if Sniff and Scurry could move on, so could he. Later, as Hall looked back on things, he realized that the cheese at Cheese Station C had not just disappeared overnight, as he had once thought. The amount of cheese that had been there towards the end had been getting smaller, and what was left had grown old. It didn't taste as good. Mold may have even begun to grow on the old cheese, although he hadn't noticed it. He had to admit, however, that if he had wanted to, he probably could have seen what was coming. But he didn't. Haw now realized that the change probably would not have taken him by surprise if he had been watching what was happening all along, and if he had anticipated change. Maybe That's what Sniff and Scurry had been doing. He stopped for a rest and wrote on the wall of the maze, "Smell the cheese often, so you know when it's getting old." Some time later, after not finding cheese for what seemed like a long time, Haw finally came across a huge cheese station, which looked promising. When he went inside, however, he was most disappointed to discover that the cheese station was empty. "This empty feeling has happened to me too often," he thought. He felt like giving up. Haw was losing his physical strength, knew he was lost, and was afraid he would not survive. He thought about turning around and heading back to Cheese Station C. At least, if he made it back and Hem was still there, Haw wouldn't be alone. Then he asked himself the same question again. What would I do if I weren't afraid? He was afraid more often than he liked to admit, even to himself. He wasn't always sure what he was afraid of, but in his weakened condition, he knew now he was simply fearful of going on alone. Haw didn't know it, but he was running behind because he was weighed down by fearful beliefs. Haw wondered if Ham had moved on, or if he was still paralyzed by his fears. Then Haw remembered the times that he had felt his best in the maze. It was when he was moving along. He wrote on the wall, knowing it was as much a reminder to himself as it was a marking for his buddy Ham, hopefully to follow. And he's read like this: movement in a new direction helps you find new cheese. Haw looked down the dark passageway and was aware of his fear. What lay ahead? Was it empty? Or worse, were there dangers lurking? He began to imagine all kinds of frightening things that could happen to him. He was scaring himself to death. Then he laughed at himself. He realized his fears were making things worse, so he did what he would do if he wasn't afraid. He moved in a new direction. As he started running down the dark corridor, he began to smile. Haw didn't realize it yet, but he was discovering what nourished his soul. He was letting go and trusting what lay ahead for him, even though he didn't know what exactly it was. To his surprise, Haw started to enjoy himself more and more. Why do I feel so good? He wondered. I don't have any cheese and I don't know where I'm going. Before long, he knew why he felt good. He stopped to write again on the wall. When you move beyond your fear, you feel free. Haw realized he'd been held captive by his own fear. Moving in a new direction had freed him. Now he felt the cool breeze that was blowing in this part of the maze, and it was refreshing. He took in some deep breath and felt invigorated by the movement. Once he had gone past his fear, it turned out to be more enjoyable than he once believed it could be. Haw hadn't felt this way for a long time. He'd almost forgotten how much fun it was. To make things even better, Haw started to paint a picture in his mind. And this is the brilliant part. He saw himself in great realistic detail, sitting in the middle of a pile of all his favorite cheeses, from cheddar to brie. He saw himself eating the many cheeses he liked, and he enjoyed what he saw. Then he imagined how much he would enjoy all their great tastes. The more clearly he saw the image of new cheese, the more real it became, and the more he could sense that he was going to find it. He wrote on the wall, imagining myself enjoying new cheese even before I find it leads me to it. Haw asked himself, why didn't I do this before?
Then he raced through the maze with greater strength and agility. Before long, he spotted a cheese station and became excited as he noticed little pieces of new cheese near the entrance. They were types of cheeses that he never had seen before, but they looked great. He tried them and found that they were delicious. He ate most of the new cheese bits that were available and put a few in his pocket to have later and perhaps share with him. He began to regain his strength. He entered the cheese station with great excitement, but to his dismay, he found it was empty. Someone had already been there and had left only a few bits of new cheese. He realized that if he had moved sooner, he would very likely have found a great deal of new cheese here. Haw decided to go back to see if Ham was ready to join him. As he retraced his steps, he stopped and wrote on the wall, "The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you find new cheese." After a while, Haw made his way back to Cheese Station C and found Ham. He offered Ham bits of new cheese but was turned down. Ham appreciated his friend's gesture but said, "I don't think I would like new cheese. It's not what I'm used to. I want my own cheese back, and I'm not going to change until I get what I want." Haw just shook his head in disappointment and reluctantly went back out on his own. As he returned to the furthest point he had reached in the maze, he missed his friend, but he realized he liked what he was discovering. Even before he found what he hoped it would be a great supply of new cheese, if ever, he knew that what made him happy wasn't just having cheese. He was happy when he wasn't being run by his fear. He liked what he was doing now. Knowing this, Haw didn't feel as weak as he did when he was staying in Cheese Station C with no cheese. Just realizing he was not letting his fear stop him, and knowing that he'd taken new direction nourished him and gave him strength. Now he felt that it was just a question of time before he found what he needed. In fact, he sensed he had already found what he was looking for. He smiled as he realized it is safer to search in the maze than remain in a cheeseless station. Haw realized again, as he had once before, that what you're afraid of is never as bad as what you imagine. The fear you let build up in your mind is worse than the situation that actually exists. He'd been so afraid of never finding new cheese that he didn't even want to start looking. But since starting his journey, he'd found enough cheese in the corridors to keep him going. Now he looked forward to finding more. Just looking ahead was becoming exciting. His old thinking had been clouded by his worries and fears. He used to think about not having enough cheese or not having it last as long as he wanted. He used to think more about what could go wrong than what could go right. But that had changed in the days since he'd left Cheese Station C. He used to believe that cheese should never be moved and that change wasn't right. Now he realized it was natural for change to continually occur. Whether you expect it or not, change could surprise you only if you didn't expect it and weren't looking for it. When he realized it changed his beliefs, he paused to write on the wall. Do you write on the wall? Do you have a little booklet or notebook? Do you keep journaling every day? So Haw writes, "Old beliefs do not lead you to new cheese." Haw hadn't found any cheese yet, but as he ran through the maze, he thought about what he had already learned. He now realized that his new beliefs were encouraging new behaviors.
He was behaving differently than when he kept returning to the same cheeseless station. He knew when you change what you believe, you change what you do. You can believe that a change will harm you and resist it, or you can believe that finding new cheese will help you to embrace the change. It all depends on what you choose to believe. He wrote on the wall again. What you see, when you see that you can find and enjoy new cheese, you change course. Haw knew it would be in better shape now if he had embraced the change much sooner and left Cheese Station C earlier. He would feel stronger in body and spirit, and he could have coped better with the challenges of finding new cheese. In fact, he probably would have found it by now if he had expected change, rather than wasting his time denying that change had already taken place. He gathered his will and decided to keep proceeding into the newer parts of the maze. He found little bits of cheese here and there and began to regain his strength and confidence. As he thought back on where he had come from, Hall was glad that he had written on the wall in many places. He trusted it would serve as a marked trail for him to follow through the maze if he chose to leave Cheese Station C. He just hoped that he was heading in the right direction. He thought about the possibility that Hem would read the handwriting on the wall and find his way. He wrote on the wall what he had been thinking about for some time. Noticing small changes early helps you adapt to bigger changes that are to come. Again, noticing small changes early helps you adapt to bigger changes that are to come. By now, Hem had let go of his past and was adaptive to the future. He continued on through the maze with greater strength and speed. And before long, it happened. When it seemed like he had been in the maze forever, his journey, or at least this part of his journey, ended quickly and happily. He found new cheese at Cheese Station and when he went inside, he was startled by what he saw. Piled high everywhere was the greatest supply of cheese he'd ever seen. He didn't recognize all that he saw, as some kinds of cheese were new to him. Then he wondered for a moment whether it was real or just his imagination, until he saw his old friends, Sniff and Scurry. Sniff welcomed Hall with a nod of his head, and Scurry waved his paw. Their fat little bellies showed that they had been there for some time. Hall quickly said his hellos, and soon took bites of every one of his favorite cheeses. He pulled off his shoes and jogging suit and folded them neatly nearby, in case he needed them again. Then he jumped into the new cheese. When he had eaten his fill, he lifted a piece of fresh cheese and made a toast. Hooray for change! As Haw enjoyed the new cheese, he reflected on what he'd learned. He realized that when he had been afraid to change, he had been holding on to the illusion of old cheese that was no longer there. So, what was it that made him change? Was it the fear of starving to death? Haw thought. Well, that helped. Then he laughed and realized that he'd started to change as soon as he'd learned to laugh at himself and at what he'd been doing wrong. He realized the fastest way to change is to laugh at your own folly. Then you can let go and quickly move on. He knew he had learned something useful about moving on from his mice buddies, Sniff and Scurry. They kept life simple. They didn't overanalyze or overcomplicate things. When the situation changed and the cheese had been moved, they changed and moved with the cheese. He would remember that.
Then Haw used his wonderful brain to do what little people do better than mice. He reflected on the mistakes he'd made in the past and used them to plan for his future. He knew that he could learn to deal with the change. He could be more aware of the need to keep things simple, be flexible, and move quickly. You did not need to overcomplicate matters or confuse yourself with fearful beliefs. You could notice when the little changes began so that you would be better prepared for the big change that might be coming. He knew he needed to adapt faster. For if you don't adapt in time, you might as well not adapt at all. He had to admit that the biggest inhibitor to change lies within yourself, and that nothing gets better until you change. Perhaps most important of all, he realized that there is always new cheese out there, whether you recognize it at the time or not, and that you are rewarded when you are rewarded with it when you go past your fear and enjoy the adventure. He knew some fear should be respected, as it can keep you out of real danger, but he realized most of his fear were irrational and had kept him from changing when he needed to change. He didn't like it at the time, but he knew that the change had turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as it led him to find better cheese. He'd even found a better part of himself. As Haw recalled what he had learned, he thought about his friend Hem. He wondered if Hem had read any of the sayings Haw had written on the wall at Cheese Station C and throughout the maze. Had Hem ever decided to let go and move on? Had he ever entered the maze and discovered what could make his life better? Haw thought about going back again to Cheese Station C to see if he could find Hem, assuming that Haw could find his way back there. If he found Hem, he thought he might be able to show him how to get out of his predicament. But Haw realized that he had already tried to get his friend to change. Hem had to find his own way, beyond his comforts and past his fears. No one else could do it for him or talk him into it. He somehow had to see the advantage of changing himself. Haw knew that he'd left a trail for him and that he could find his way if he could just read the handwriting on the wall. He went over and wrote down a summary of what he'd learned on the largest wall of the cheese station, and he drew a large piece of cheese around all the insights that he'd become aware of, and smiled as he looked at what he'd learned. It looked something like this. The handwriting on the wall says, "Change happens, but keep moving the cheese. Anticipate change, get ready for the cheese to move. Monitor change, smell the cheese often so you know when it's getting old. Adapt to change quickly. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you can enjoy new cheese. Change, move with the cheese. Enjoy change, savor the adventure, and enjoy the taste of new cheese. Be ready to change quickly and enjoy it again. They keep moving the cheese." Haw realized how far he had come since he'd been with Ham and Cheese Station C, but knew it would be easy for him to slip back if he got too comfortable. Each day he inspected Cheese Station N to see what the condition of the cheese was. He was going to do whatever he could to avoid being surprised by unexpected change. While Haw still had a great supply of cheese, he often went out in the maze and explored new areas to stay in touch with what was happening around him. He knew, not quickly, he knew it was safer to be aware of his real choices than to isolate himself in his comfort zone. Then Haw heard what he thought was the sound of movement out in the maze. As the noise grew louder, he realized that someone was coming. Could it be that Hem was arriving? Was he about to turn the corner? Haw said a little prayer and hoped, as he had many times before, that maybe at last his friend was finally able to move with the cheese and enjoy it. And that concludes the story, right?
I'm not gonna go through the discussion part of the book, just to entice you to read it yourself. But it's a great story, isn't it? It's a great story. Which character do you think you are? Are you the mice or the little people? Are you Hem or are you Haw? It's important to realize that change is around us and it's happening every day. We're growing older, the world is changing, new technologies come around every other day, economy keeps turning over and over. We find new friends, we lose old friends, new opportunities come around, and we lose touch with some old opportunities we were comfortably accustomed to. So it's always nice to have this kind of analogy, to be able to think about your own current situation. All right,
Gotta go. See you next time.